November 4th, 1862, Indianapolis, Indiana. In a wood-paneled office on a cold Tuesday afternoon, a patent clerk in Washington affixes his signature to document number 36,836. The drawing attached shows a contraption of rotating barrels, gears, and a hand crank. The title reads simply, Improvement in Revolving Battery Guns. The inventor's name appears in neat script below. Richard J. Gatling of Indianapolis, County of Marion, State of Indiana. 350 miles to the east, on Virginia battlefields still slick with recent blood, Union and Confederate soldiers load single-shot rifles, one paper cartridge at a time. Each man can fire perhaps 3 rounds per minute if his hands stay steady. The document on the clerk's desk describes a machine that can fire 200 rounds in that same 60 seconds. Neither the clerk nor the inventor could know they were holding the seed of something that would fundamentally reshape the calculus of killing. The gun would not save lives as its maker hoped. It would take them by the tens of thousands, across continents and decades, with an efficiency that would make the old methods of warfare look like children's games. The Gatling gun sits at a peculiar intersection in the mythology of the American West. It appears in our imagined frontier as a mechanical beast, smoke billowing from its barrels, mowing down charging warriors or desperate outlaws. But the documented reality is more complicated and more consequential than the legend. The gun emerged not from the dust of frontier trading posts, but from the mind of a prosperous farmer's son who never fired a shot in anger. It was designed not to expand American territory, but to save soldiers from disease. It saw limited use in the Civil War itself, rejected by conservative military minds who could not envision how to deploy such concentrated firepower. Yet by the time Richard Jordan Gatling died in 1903, his creation had become the defining technological advantage in dozens of colonial wars, the mechanical edge that allowed handfuls of soldiers to dominate thousands. The story of the Gatling gun is the story of how American industrial ingenuity, humanitarian intentions, and the accelerating pace of technological change collided with the brutal realities of empire building. It is a story told not in the romantic imagery of the Wild West, but in patent drawings, manufacturing records, and the body counts from battles on 4 continents. The question is not whether the Gatling gun changed warfare. It did. Irrevocably. The question is whether it changed warfare in the direction its inventor imagined, and what that tells us about the distance between intention and consequence in the age of mechanized killing. Richard Jordan Gatling entered the world on September 12, 1818, in the Maney's Neck section of Hartford County, North Carolina. His father, Jordan Gatling, was an enslaver who owned a plantation spanning more than 1,000 acres of prime agricultural land along the coastal plain. The household was one of relative prosperity and mechanical curiosity. Jordan Gatling held patents for machines used in sewing and thinning cotton, innovations granted by the United States Patent Office in 1835 that reflected the father's practical engineering mind. The plantation operated as a largely self-sufficient enterprise where practical engineering was a daily necessity. Enslaved workers cultivated cotton, corn, and wheat. The Gatling family included Richard's mother, Mary Barnes Gatling, 3 brothers, Thomas Barnes, James Henry, and William Jesse, and 2 sisters, Mary Ann and Martha Sarah. Young Richard attended Buckhorn Academy in Como, a local common school that provided basic education in reading, writing, and arithmetic. He later worked briefly as a schoolmaster before opening a country store near the town of Winton. The environment on the plantation was one where invention was not merely encouraged, but expected. James Henry Gatling, Richard's older brother, became fascinated with heavier-than-air flight, and in the 1870s constructed a crude hand-powered aircraft with which he experimented unsuccessfully. He also invented and patented devices for chopping cotton stalks and converting pine into light wood. Richard grew up in an environment where the challenge was not whether a machine could be made, but whether it could be made profitable, patentable and superior to existing designs. At age 21 in 1839, Richard Gatling designed a screw propeller for steamboats. The design utilized a helical blade arrangement that he believed would provide more efficient propulsion than the cumbersome paddle wheels then in use on riverboats plying the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. He believed he had created something novel, something that would revolutionize river transport and make his fortune. He traveled to Washington to file for a patent, only to discover that Swedish-born inventor John Ericsson had filed for an identical device mere months earlier. The disappointment might have crushed a lesser spirit. Instead, it taught Gatling 3 lessons that would shape his career. Speed matters in the patent race. Protecting innovations under law is essential, and the American patent system, established by the Constitution and refined by Congress in 1836, guaranteed ordinary citizens the right to profit from their inventions. This was unique in world history. European inventors often struggled to secure patents or found their rights poorly protected. American inventors, by contrast, could file relatively inexpensively, receive federal protection, and license their inventions to manufacturers across the country. Gatling would exploit this system brilliantly over the next 6 decades. He turned his attention to agriculture, the sector he knew intimately from his childhood. His first successful patent came in 1839 for a rice seed planter. The device mechanized the tedious process of planting rice in the wetlands of the South, where enslaved laborers had previously done the work by hand. The planter used a rotating drum with cups that picked up seeds from a hopper and deposited them at regular intervals as the machine was drawn across the field. It was elegant, simple, and scalable. By 1844, he had moved west to St. Louis, Missouri, a booming river city at the junction of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. St. Louis in the 1840s was a city of approximately 35,000 people, growing rapidly as the gateway to Western expansion. Gatling established a business manufacturing agricultural equipment and converted his rice planter into a wheat drill that proved enormously successful in the expanding grain fields of the Midwest. The device allowed farmers to plant wheat seeds at consistent depths and spacing, which dramatically improved germination rates and yields compared to broadcast seeding. By the late 1840s, Gatling's wheat drill was in use across Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. The economic impact was substantial. Farmers who adopted the drill could plant more acres with less labor and achieve better harvests. Gatling licensed manufacturing rights to local firms in multiple states, collecting royalties on each unit sold. It was a business model that would serve him well with future inventions. The wheat drill was displayed at the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London's Crystal Palace as an example of American industrial ingenuity and mechanical innovation. The exhibition, formally titled The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations, opened on May 1, 1851, in a massive glass and iron structure erected in Hyde Park. Among the 13,000 exhibits from around the world, American products garnered particular attention for their practicality and mass production potential. Gatling's wheat drill sat alongside Samuel Colt's revolvers, Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper, and other devices that signaled America's emergence as a manufacturing power. During the winter of 1845, while traveling by riverboat on business down the Ohio River, Gatling contracted smallpox. The disease, caused by the variola virus, was one of the most feared afflictions of the 19th century, killing approximately 30% of those infected and leaving survivors with permanent scars and sometimes blindness. Gatling fell ill aboard the boat and for 2 weeks could not obtain adequate medical attention. River towns were wary of smallpox cases, and medical care along the waterways was rudimentary at best. He suffered through high fever, the eruption of pustules across his face and body, and the genuine possibility of death. The experience nearly killed him. Upon recovery, his face bore the scars, but his mind carried a new conviction. He needed medical knowledge to care for himself and his family. In 1847, at age 29, he enrolled as a student in the Indiana Medical College, the medical department of LaPorte University in LaPorte, Indiana. He later took classes at the Ohio Medical College in Cincinnati, one of the more respected medical schools west of the Alleghenies. On graduation in 1850, he received a medical degree certifying him as a physician. He never practiced medicine in any public capacity. Patients never consulted him. He never set up an office or hung out a shingle. Invention, not healing, was his calling. Yet he always thereafter styled himself Dr. Gatling, a title that conveyed professional respectability and suggested humanitarian motives that would prove useful when marketing instruments of death. By the early 1850s, Gatling had settled in Indianapolis and prospered through real estate speculation and continued inventing. He patented a hemp-breaking machine in 1850 and a steam plow in 1857. In 1860 alone, he received 5 patents for various agricultural implements. On October 25, 1854, he married Jemima Sanders, 19 years his junior, and the daughter of a prominent Indianapolis physician. Her older sister, Zerelda, was married to David Wallace, a former governor of Indiana. Gatling moved in circles of influence and capital. He was elected the first president of the American Association of Inventors and Manufacturers in 1891, a position he held for 6 years. He was also an active member of Center Lodge No. 23 of the Masons. By any measure, by the late 1850s, Richard Gatling was a successful man, financially secure, socially connected, and respected for his mechanical skill. The Civil War began in April 1861. Gatling was 42 years old, living in Indianapolis, far from the front lines. His sympathies lay with the Union despite his North Carolina roots, though suspicions about his loyalties would dog him throughout the war. In November 1861, he attended an exhibition in Indianapolis where a Mr. Hatch of Ohio demonstrated a breech-loading cannon designed like a revolver that could fire 25 shots per minute. Gatling watched the demonstration and saw a possibility. Within weeks, he had sketched the initial design for a weapon with multiple rotating barrels fed by a hopper of ammunition, each barrel firing independently as a hand crank rotated the assembly. He based the feeding mechanism on the same principle as his seed planter: gravity-fed, sequential delivery, and mechanical consistency. The logic was elegant. A single-barrel gun firing rapidly would overheat and jam. The barrel would expand from heat, affecting accuracy. The breech mechanism would foul with powder residue. Sustained fire was impossible. Multiple barrels firing in sequence would each have time to cool while the others fired. By July 1862, Gatling had a working prototype. The gun consisted of 6 rifle barrels, each .58 caliber, arranged around a central shaft. Each barrel had its own breech bolt. As the operator turned the crank, the entire barrel assembly rotated. At the 12 o'clock position, a paper cartridge dropped from the hopper into the breech. As rotation continued, the bolt closed and locked. At approximately the 4 o'clock position, a cam activated the firing pin. The cartridge discharged. As rotation continued, the spent cartridge case was extracted and ejected at approximately the 6 o'clock position. The barrel then cooled during the remaining rotation back to 12 o'clock, where it received a fresh cartridge. 6 barrels meant 6 shots per complete revolution of the crank. A skilled operator could turn the crank rapidly enough to achieve 200 shots per minute, though rates varied with the operator's strength and the reliability of ammunition feed. On July 14, 1862, in Indianapolis, 3 witnesses, T.A. Morris, A. Bolweg, and D.G. Rose, certified that they had tested the gun at the direction of Governor Oliver P. Morton of Indiana. Their written statement, preserved in state archives, confirmed that the gun could discharge as rapidly as 150 times per minute with desirable accuracy and could be continued for hours without danger, as we think, from overheating. But Morris, Baldwin, and Rose admitted that only field service would prove the point. They recommended that Morton order enough guns for testing in battle. The governor was enthusiastic but unwilling to risk state funds on an unproven weapon at that time. He sent Gatling to Washington with a letter of introduction to P.H. Watson, the new Assistant Secretary of War under Edwin Stanton. Watson received Gatling politely but took no immediate action. The War Department was flooded with inventors hawking miracle weapons, and Ripley, the Chief of Ordnance, had grown deeply conservative about adopting anything not already proven in combat. On November 4, 1862, the United States Patent Office issued patent number 36836 to Richard J. Gatling for his improvement in revolving battery guns. The first model used paper cartridges, 6 rotating barrels without stocks arranged around a central rod, each barrel with its own bolt. The entire cluster revolved by turning a crank. 2 men operated the weapon, one to sight and turn the crank, the other to feed ammunition into the hopper. The gun was mounted on a wheeled carriage. In theory, it could fire 200 rounds per minute. In practice, early models were prone to jamming, particularly when cranked too rapidly or when paper cartridges became damp. Gatling contracted with Miles H. Greenwood and Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, to manufacture the first 6 production guns at their Eagle Iron Works facility. Tragedy struck in December 1862 when fire destroyed the manufacturing facility. Lost in the flames were the 6 nearly complete guns and most of Gatling's plans. The setback was total. Gatling had financed the production himself and now had nothing to show for it but patent papers and ashes. Undaunted, Gatling secured financial backing from Cincinnati businessmen McWhinney, Ringe and Company. Together, they convinced the Cincinnati Type Factory to manufacture 13 improved models. These guns used the newly developed brass cartridge instead of paper, which greatly improved reliability. In May 1863, one gun was tested by the United States Naval Yard in Washington and passed preliminary trials. Admiral John A. Dahlgren, Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, gave official permission to interested naval commanders to order Gatlings if they wished. In August 1863, Gatling wrote to Admiral David Dixon Porter offering to sell guns to the Navy. Porter bought one. The Army, however, remained skeptical. The Chief of Ordnance, General James W. Ripley, was an efficient administrator but a conservative technician who distrusted new weapons that had not proven themselves under field conditions. He refused to recommend adoption. Gatling faced another obstacle: suspicion about his loyalties. In June 1864, during the war, Brigadier General Henry B. Carrington, head of Army Intelligence in Indianapolis, received reports from detectives that Gatling attended secret meetings of the Sons of Liberty, an organization working to subvert the Union war effort and aid the Confederacy. Carrington wrote to the Ordnance Bureau in Washington to check on the Army's relationship with Gatling. The accusation arose again in testimony before a military commission that autumn during the Indianapolis Civil War treason trials. Gatling published a statement in Indianapolis newspapers defending himself. No formal charges were ever brought, but the cloud of suspicion lingered and may have contributed to the Army's reluctance to adopt his weapon during the war. Only one Union general showed enthusiasm. Benjamin F. Butler, known for aggressive tactics and a willingness to try unconventional methods, purchased 12 Gatling guns in 1864 with his own funds at a cost of $12,000. The guns, along with carriages, limbers, and a supply of steel charges, were delivered to Butler's command. Butler deployed the Gatlings during the siege of Petersburg, Virginia, which lasted from June 1864 to April 1865. In the grinding trench warfare around Petersburg, where Confederate and Union lines faced each other across fortified positions bristling with artillery and sharpshooters, the Gatling guns provided suppressive fire. They cleared the space in front of trenches and broke up Confederate attempts to mass troops for assault. 8 additional Gatlings were fitted on Union gunboats operating on rivers. but the war ended in April 1865 before the guns saw widespread use. The official total of Gatlings deployed during the Civil War was a handful, perhaps 20 guns at most. Their impact on the war's outcome was negligible. What mattered was what came after. In 1865, Gatling severed his business relationship with McWhinney, Ringe and Company and signed a contract with Cooper Fire Arms Manufacturing Company in Philadelphia. He continued refining the gun, producing an improved model in 1865 capable of firing 350 rounds per minute when using brass cartridges and an enhanced feeding mechanism. In May 1866, Gatling arranged a demonstration at Fortress Monroe in Virginia for Army observers. This time, the weapon performed flawlessly. The Ordnance Department was impressed. On August 24, 1866, the United States Army officially adopted the Gatling gun and placed an order for 100 guns, 50 chambered for the new .50-70 centerfire cartridge, and 51-inch guns designed to fire canister shot. The contract was awarded, but Gatling needed a major manufacturer with the capacity and precision tooling to fulfill it. He approached Colt's Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company in Hartford, Connecticut. Samuel Colt had died in 1862 at age 47, but his widow, Elizabeth Jarvis Colt, had inherited controlling interest in what had been the world's largest private armament factory. In 1864, the Colt Armory had burned, but Elizabeth had insured the property and rebuilt the facilities using the most modern manufacturing techniques available. The new factory, completed in 1867, featured precision machine tools capable of producing interchangeable parts to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. This was the American system of manufacturing at its apex: standardized components, division of labor, mechanized production. Colt employed hundreds of skilled machinists, toolmakers, and assemblers. The company faced declining demand after the war's end as military contracts dried up and the Army reduced its size. The Gatling contract came at an opportune moment. Colt completed and delivered the 100 guns in 1867, each gun meeting Army specifications for caliber, rate of fire, and mechanical reliability. The 1-inch guns, massive weapons weighing over 1,000 pounds each, could fire canister shot that scattered metal balls in a cone of destruction or single solid projectiles weighing approximately 8 ounces. The 50-70 guns were lighter and more maneuverable, intended for cavalry and infantry support. From that point until the end of Gatling gun production in 1911, every Gatling manufactured in the United States was made by Colt in Hartford. Between 1866 and 1911, Colt produced more than 1,000 Gatling guns in various calibers and configurations. The partnership proved mutually beneficial. Colt had the precision machinery and skilled labor to produce the complex multi-barrel system with its intricate cam mechanisms, feed systems, and rotating assemblies. Each gun required hundreds of precision-machined parts that had to fit together with minimal tolerance. The barrel cluster alone demanded careful alignment and balance. The lock cylinder that housed the individual bolts for each barrel required precise boring. The cam track that controlled the firing sequence needed exact geometry. Colt's machinists, many trained in the manufacture of Colt revolvers, possessed the skills necessary for this level of precision work. Gatling brought the patents, the design refinements, and, crucially, the salesmanship. He was a tireless promoter who understood that selling weapons required demonstrating their effectiveness to skeptical military officers and government officials. In 1870, Gatling sold the manufacturing rights to Colt outright. The financial terms were not publicly disclosed, but the arrangement gave Gatling capital while allowing him to focus on sales and continued refinement of the design. He and his family moved from Indianapolis to Hartford in 1874, purchasing a substantial home on Wethersfield Avenue in Hartford's affluent South End. The house, a Victorian Gothic revival mansion with ornate woodwork and modern conveniences, reflected his prosperity. They resided there until 1897. The same year they moved, 1874, the Gatling Gun Company relocated its main office from Indianapolis to Hartford and incorporated under Connecticut state law. Colt officials served on the board of the Gatling Gun Company. The manufacturing was done in the same Hartford factory where Colt revolvers, rifles, and shotguns were made. Workers moved between product lines as demand shifted. A machinist who spent Monday boring barrels for Colt Peacemaker revolvers might spend Tuesday fitting bolts for Gatling gun lock cylinders. The manufacturing facility itself was a marvel. The Colt Armory complex in Hartford eventually grew to encompass multiple buildings covering acres along the Connecticut River. Steam engines powered the machinery. Belt drives transmitted power from overhead shafts to individual lathes, mills, and boring machines. The noise was deafening, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam, the rhythmic clatter of stamping presses. Workers labored 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Wages varied by skill level. An unskilled laborer might earn $1.50 per day. A skilled machinist could command $3 or more. Women worked in the assembly areas and earned less than men for comparable work. By 1897, Gatling had been succeeded as company president by John J. Hall and Lewis C. Grover, both of whom were Colt executives. Hall served as Colt's secretary and treasurer. Grover held similar positions. In effect, the Gatling Gun Company had been absorbed into Colt's corporate structure, a wholly owned subsidiary in all but name. The arrangement worked because both parties benefited. Gatling received royalties on each gun sold. Colt received exclusive rights to manufacture a weapon with steady military and foreign government demand. Hartford received industrial employment and the reputation as America's arsenal. The arrangement worked. Gatling focused on sales and traveled extensively in Europe and Asia, promoting his weapon. Colt provided manufacturing quality that gave American-made weapons an impeccable reputation. The gun evolved rapidly. The model 1874 introduced a 10-barrel configuration and improved feed system. By 1882, with refinements to the action and ammunition feed, the gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. By 1886, the rate exceeded 400 rounds per minute in sustained fire. The smallest caliber guns used the Broadwell drum feed, a 20-spoke arrangement holding 400 rounds that rotated manually as each stack emptied. The patent for the Broadwell drum, named after L.W. Broadwell, an agent for Gatling's company, was granted as U.S. Patent 110338 in 1871. The model 1881 switched to the Bruce-style feed system, which accepted 2 rows of ammunition in a curved box. While one row fed into the gun, the other could be reloaded, allowing sustained fire. By 1893, the Gatling was adapted to take the new .30 Army smokeless cartridge. The M1893 guns featured 6 barrels, later increased to 10, and were capable of a maximum initial rate of fire of 800 to 900 rounds per minute, though 600 rounds per minute was recommended for continuous fire to prevent overheating. The Gatling gun's finest moment in American service came during the Spanish-American War in 1898. On July 1, 1898, during the assault on San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill outside Santiago, Cuba, a battery of 4 Model 1895 10-barrel Gatling guns in .30 Army caliber formed a separate detachment commanded by Lieutenant John Henry Parker. Parker, a firm believer in the offensive use of machine guns, positioned his guns to provide direct fire support for the American infantry assault. As American troops charged up the slopes, 3 Gatlings with swivel mountings fired a total of 18,000 rounds in 8.5 minutes. That averages to more than 700 rounds per minute per gun of continuous fire. The suppressive fire caused significant Spanish casualties and prevented defenders from concentrating their fire on the advancing Americans. Parker's guns also turned back Spanish counterattacks by decimating an attacking battalion of Spanish regulars. President Theodore Roosevelt, who participated in the charge as commander of the Rough Riders, later praised Parker's invaluable work on the field of battle, as much in attack as in defense. The success at San Juan Hill demonstrated that machine guns could be used offensively, not merely as defensive weapons to hold static positions. But even this success contained the seeds of the Gatling's obsolescence. The guns' weight, approximately 1,000 pounds each, and their cumbersome artillery carriages made them difficult to move over rough terrain. In Cuba, where roads were often little more than jungle footpaths, the Gatlings struggled to keep up with infantry. During the Philippine-American War that followed, American forces again used Gatlings, including at the Battle of San Jacinto on November 11, 1899. But in the heavily forested mountains of the Philippines, the gun's mobility limitations became even more apparent. By the time of the Spanish-American War, the Gatling faced stiff competition. In 1883, Hiram Maxim had patented a true automatic machine gun that used the recoil energy from each fired round to cycle the action. The Maxim gun required no hand crank. The operator simply held the trigger. Fed from a cloth belt, it could fire up to 600 rounds per minute. Most importantly, it was far lighter and more portable than a Gatling. The British adopted the Maxim in the 1880s and used it with devastating effect in colonial wars. Other nations followed. By the mid-1890s, single-barrel automatic machine guns from Maxim, Vickers, and later John Browning were supplanting the Gatling in military arsenals worldwide. Gatling understood the threat. He attempted numerous improvements to keep his design competitive. In the 1870s and 1880s, he scaled down the weapon and lightened it, launching bulldog and camel models that were smaller, easier to transport, and mounted on tripods instead of wheeled carriages. The Egyptian army purchased some of these smaller camel guns in 1872. During the siege of Khartoum, an Egyptian Gatling gun aided by a telescope successfully targeted Sudanese artillery crews from a distance of 2,000 yards. But the most ambitious improvement came in 1893. On July 25, 1893, Gatling received U.S. patent number 502-185 for a system attaching an electric motor to his gun. The motor was designed to be easily attached and removed, allowing the gun to be fired manually or by motor as needed. The electrically powered Gatling gun, with 10 barrels and water cooling, had a theoretical rate of fire of 3,000 rounds per minute. Even after Gatling slowed the mechanism for reliability, the electric model could fire roughly 3 times faster than a typical single-barrel machine gun. The concept was visionary. It anticipated by 70 years the electrically powered rotary cannons that would dominate aerial combat in the Vietnam War. But in the 1890s, the idea was impractical for several reasons. First, feed systems of the era could not reliably supply ammunition at 3,000 rounds per minute. Second, the gun required a separate electrical power source, which meant it could only be deployed where generators were available, primarily on warships or in fixed fortifications. Third, and most importantly, military strategists in the 1890s did not know what to do with a weapon capable of such astounding rates of fire. The tactical doctrine for deploying machine guns was still evolving. Armies were uncertain about how to use the machine guns they already had, let alone one that consumed ammunition at 3,000 rounds per minute. The United States Army Ordnance Department acknowledged in internal correspondence that Gatling's electrically powered gun was the fastest-firing weapon in the world. In 1914, 11 years after Gatling's death, the Ordnance Department noted that the electric Gatling remained the fastest-firing weapon in existence, faster even than the newly adopted Vickers machine gun. But speed alone did not equal military utility. No military force adopted the electric Gatling. In 1895, Gatling made a final attempt to create a fully automatic version using gas. Pressure from the gunpowder explosions to rotate the barrels, eliminating the need for a hand crank or motor. This gas-operated Gatling was also not adopted. By then, the Maxim and its descendants had won the machine gun market. They were lighter, cheaper, simpler to maintain, and fully automatic. The Gatling guns era was ending. Between 1867 and 1900, Gatling guns were purchased by dozens of nations and saw combat on every inhabited continent. Russia was among the first European powers to recognize the weapon's potential. In 1867, Gatling traveled to Russia and spent several weeks demonstrating his gun. Russia placed an order for 120 10-barrel Gatlings in 1868 and 1869, chambered for the .42 caliber cartridge used in the Russian bear-down rifle, also manufactured by Colt. These guns, known in Russia as Gorlov guns after Colonel Alexander Pavlovich Gorlov, who arranged the purchase, first saw action during the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. Russian forces used them effectively at the Battle of Nikopol and the Siege of Plevna. During the Russian conquest of Central Asia in the 1870s and 1880s, Gatlings repelled Turkmen cavalry charges, allowing small Russian garrisons to hold positions against numerically superior forces. By 1876, Russia had 400 Gatlings organized in 8 batteries. Nobel Brothers of St. Petersburg was granted a license to manufacture Gatlings for domestic use. Turkey, a long-standing enemy of Russia, ordered 200 10-barrel Gatlings in 1870, chambered for the Turkish Snyder .58 caliber cartridge. The British Empire became one of the Gatling's most enthusiastic customers and most prolific users. Between 1869 and 1900, British forces purchased hundreds of Gatlings in various calibers and configurations. The guns were deployed to India, Africa, Burma, and anywhere else that British colonial ambitions met indigenous resistance. British military theorists quickly grasped what many American officers had missed. The Gatling was not primarily an offensive weapon, but a force multiplier for defensive positions and a psychological weapon that broke enemy morale. During the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, British forces deployed Gatlings with devastating effect against Zulu impis, the massed formations of warriors armed with ikealwa stabbing spears, throwing spears, and ox-hide shields. The Zulu military system, developed under King Shaka earlier in the century, relied on disciplined formations executing pincer movements at close quarters. Zulu warriors were formidable fighters, brave to the point of recklessness, capable of covering 50 miles per day on foot and closing rapidly with an enemy despite heavy fire. Against single-shot rifles, Zulu tactics sometimes succeeded through sheer numbers and courage. Against Gatlings, the tactics became suicidal. At the Battle of Ulundi on July 4, 1879, the climactic engagement of the war, British commander Lord Chelmsford formed his 4,200 soldiers and 600 native auxiliaries into a large square formation. Inside the square, he positioned artillery pieces and 2 Gatling guns. The Zulu army, numbering between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors, attacked in a massive assault, surging forward in the traditional buffalo horns formation. British troops opened fire at 600 yards with Martini Henry rifles. The Gatlings began firing at 400 yards. The chattering roar of the Gatlings, each firing approximately 300 rounds per minute, tore gaps in the Zulu formations. Warriors fell in clusters. The attack faltered, regrouped, came on again. The Gatlings never stopped firing. Ammunition bearers kept the hoppers filled. The barrels glowed red but did not fail. The battle lasted approximately 90 minutes. When the Zulus finally withdrew, leaving more than 1,000 dead on the field, British casualties numbered 13 killed and 69 wounded. The disparity spoke not to superior courage or discipline, but to superior firepower applied from a defensive position. One British officer wrote in his diary that the Gatlings had done the work of 2 infantry companies. Another noted that the psychological effect of the guns, the unending chatter and the visible effect of bullets scything through formations, was as important as the actual casualties inflicted. In 1882, British forces used Gatlings during the suppression of the Arabi revolt in Egypt. Colonel Urabi Pasha had led a nationalist movement against the Khedive and European influence. British forces landed at Alexandria and advanced toward Cairo. At the Battle of Tel el-Kebir on September 13, 1882, British forces attacked Egyptian defensive positions before dawn. Gatlings provided supporting fire during the assault and were brought forward to suppress counterattacks. The battle lasted less than an hour. British casualties were approximately 450. Egyptian casualties exceeded 2,000. British use of Gatlings in Africa continued through the 1880s and 1890s. During the Mahdist War in Sudan, British and Egyptian forces fighting the followers of the Mahdi Muhammad Ahmad deployed Gatlings on river gunboats and in defensive lagers. At the Battle of Abu Klea on January 17, 1885, British forces formed a square that was briefly broken by a Mahdist charge, but Gatling fire helped restore the position. At the Battle of Omdurman on September 2, 1898, the decisive engagement that destroyed Mahdist power, British forces under General Kitchener deployed Maxim machine guns rather than Gatlings. But the tactical principle remained the same: concentrated automatic fire, breaking mass charges. British colonial forces also deployed Gatlings in the Second Afghan War of 1878 to 1880, the various Burma campaigns of the 1880s, and punitive expeditions in West Africa. The guns were mounted on river gunboats, on fortified positions, and occasionally on wheeled carriages for field use. British manufacturers also produced Gatlings under license. Armstrong and Company of Newcastle, upon Tyne, manufactured the British pattern Gatlings chambered for the .45 Martini Henry cartridge used in British service rifles. These guns featured slight modifications to the feed system and carriage design, but followed Gatling's basic principles. The British also developed the so-called camel guns, smaller caliber Gatlings mounted on tripods instead of wheeled carriages. These could be broken down and transported by camel or mule over terrain where wheeled vehicles could not go. The British deployed camel guns in desert and mountain campaigns where mobility was essential. A three-man crew could set up a camel gun in minutes, fire until opposition collapsed, then break down and move to a new position. From an imperialist standpoint, the machine gun was nearly the perfect labor-saving device. A British military governor in Africa calculated that one Gatling gun replaced approximately 30 riflemen in defensive firepower, while requiring only a three-man crew. This meant smaller garrisons could hold larger territories against larger populations. The economic logic was compelling. Sending soldiers to Africa was expensive. Paying them, feeding them, providing medical care, replacing those who died of disease or combat. The costs mounted quickly. Anything that reduced the number of soldiers needed reduced costs and political risk. Machine guns, whether Gatlings or later Maxims, provided exactly that advantage. They enabled tiny forces of colonizers to mow down vastly larger indigenous populations at ranges where return fire was ineffective. Egypt itself, under Khedive Ismail Pasha, had ordered 120 Colt 1865 six-barrel Gatlings after witnessing trials at Shoeburyness in 1866. Egyptian forces used Gatlings both on land and aboard river gunboats in Sudan and Abyssinia. Some West African states purchased Gatlings and used them in regional conflicts. During the Kalabari Civil War of 1879 to 1883, the Abbey House bought a Gatling from King Jaja of Opobo and may have used it in canoe warfare. The Ijesha used a Gatling against the Ibadan during the early 1880s. In 1882, the Bonny used a Gatling during an attack on New Calabar. The gun became a symbol of technological dominance. Its presence deterred violent resistance during the United States takeover of Hawaii from Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. When American Marines landed with Gatlings and the Queen surrendered rather than face the inevitable bloodshed. The Gatling was also produced under license in Europe. Armstrong and Company of Newcastle upon Tyne in England and Paget and Company of Vienna manufactured Gatlings for regional markets. According to the Hartford Courant in November 1873, more than 1,000 Gatlings had been manufactured at the Colt works by that date, with government contracts and state orders being filled. The newspaper noted that several foreign powers, including England, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, already had Gatlings in use. Closer to home, the United States Army deployed Gatlings at frontier forts and on cavalry expeditions during the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s. The pattern of deployment reflected the Army's uncertain doctrine about how to use rapid-fire weapons. Some commanders saw Gatlings as defensive tools for protecting static positions. Others tried to integrate them into mobile cavalry operations with mixed results. A Gatling detachment under Lieutenant James W. Pope accompanied General Nelson A. Miles's expedition into West Texas in August 1874 during the Red River War. The campaign targeted Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne bands who had left their reservations and were raiding settlements in Texas and Kansas. On August 30, 1874, as an advance party of Army scouts entered Palo Duro Canyon, a trail between two high bluffs, approximately 300 warriors charged down the cliffs in an attempt to cut off the scouts. Pope brought the Gatlings into action, positioning them to sweep the approach routes. The mechanical chatter echoed off the canyon walls. The attack faltered and broke. Army casualties were minimal. The number of indigenous casualties was not officially recorded, though reports mentioned many wounded carried away. The psychological impact of the Gatlings was substantial. Plains warriors had learned to fight against single-shot rifles, using terrain, speed, and tactical mobility to close with Army units. The sustained fire of Gatlings changed the calculus. There was no gap between shots to exploit, no moment when the shooter had to reload. Between 1874 and 1878, Gatling guns were fired at Native Americans resisting the takeover of their homelands on at least half a dozen occasions documented in military records. At the Battle of the Big Hole on August 9, 1877, during the Nez Perce War, Army forces used a Gatling, but it jammed after a few rounds and played little role in the engagement. The Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, outmaneuvered Army forces throughout the campaign and nearly reached sanctuary in Canada before surrendering in October 1877. During the pursuit, Army commanders debated whether Gatlings would have been useful, but the gun's weight and the mountainous terrain made deployment impractical. At Fort Sill in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, Gatlings were mounted on fortifications to deter attacks on the garrison and to overawe visiting tribal delegations during treaty negotiations. The mere presence of the guns, their barrels visible from the parade ground, communicated a message about the futility of armed resistance. Similar deployments occurred at Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory, Fort Riley in Kansas, and other frontier posts. The results were uniformly one-sided when Gatlings were brought to bear in combat. Warriors armed with single-shot rifles, repeating carbines, bows, and lances could not withstand the concentrated fire of even a single Gatling positioned in a prepared position. The rate of fire, 200 to 400 rounds per minute depending on the model and operator, meant that a three-man Gatling crew could deliver the firepower of an entire infantry company. The guns served not merely as weapons, but as instruments of psychological terror, demonstrating technological superiority that rendered traditional forms of resistance futile. Army officers writing reports and memoirs sometimes noted with clinical detachment the effect of Gatling fire on massed targets. One report described how the 50 caliber bullets, each weighing approximately an ounce, produced massive trauma when they struck human bodies at ranges under 300 yards. Another noted that the visible effect of Gatling fire, with multiple rounds striking the same area in seconds, caused panic even among disciplined warriors. The guns rarely jammed in combat after the switch to brass cartridges, though mechanical failures still occurred. Ammunition feed was the weak point. The gravity-fed hopper system required constant attention from the loader, who had to ensure cartridges fed smoothly without jamming or double feeding. The Bruce feed system, introduced in 1881, improved reliability but still required skilled operation. Yet one of the most famous Indian battles of the era was notable for the absence of Gatlings. On June 25, 1876, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer chose not to bring Gatling guns with his main force during the campaign that culminated in the Battle of the Little Big Horn. Custer believed the guns would slow his movement and reduce his mobility. He was proven catastrophically wrong when his entire command was wiped out by Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. Military analysts debated whether Gatlings would have saved Custer's command. The consensus was that they probably would have, but the debate highlighted a persistent problem. The Gatling's weight and bulk made it unsuitable for rapid cavalry maneuvers. In domestic conflicts, the mere presence of Gatlings often sufficed to prevent violence. During a labor strike in Waterbury, Connecticut in February 1903, Connecticut Governor Abiram Chamberlain called up the National Guard for the first time in state history. National Guard units from Hartford, New Haven, New Britain, and Bristol converged on Waterbury by train, bringing their Gatling gun sections with them. The guns were placed in the armory basement and never deployed. The New York Journal reported that machine guns were trained for action, but the Hartford Courant tersely noted the machine guns remained in the armory basement. The strike ended without shots fired. Labor leaders understood that if the Gatlings emerged from the basement, the result would be massacre. Similar deployments occurred during labor unrest in other states. In 1877, 2 Gatlings were brought by a Pennsylvania National Guard unit from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to use against striking workers. The guns were positioned but not fired. The message was clear: resistance would meet overwhelming force. By the turn of the century, Connecticut's National Guard alone had Gatling gun sections in multiple regiments, each consisting of several guns and trained crews. These units existed not to repel foreign invasion, but to suppress domestic disorder. The Gatling gun succeeded because it solved a problem that had vexed weapons designers for centuries: how to achieve a high rate of fire without overheating. Gatling's solution was elegantly simple. Multiple barrels firing in sequence allowed each barrel time to cool while others fired. The hand crank provided a mechanical advantage, allowing an operator to cycle the barrels faster than human muscle could work a lever-action rifle. The gravity-fed hopper, later replaced by more sophisticated feed systems, ensured a steady supply of ammunition. These principles were not revolutionary individually, but Gatling combined them into a reliable, manufacturable weapon at precisely the moment when industrial capacity and metalworking precision made mass production possible. The gun also benefited from timing and continuous refinement. The development of brass cartridges in the 1860s eliminated the reliability problems that plagued paper cartridge guns. Paper cartridges became damp in humid conditions, tore during loading, and allowed gas leakage at the breech that reduced velocity and fouled mechanisms. Brass cases, by contrast, expanded when fired to seal the breech perfectly, preventing gas leakage. The primer, embedded in the base of the brass cartridge, provided consistent ignition. Spent brass cases extracted cleanly without tearing or leaving residue. The transition to smokeless powder in the 1880s further improved performance. Black powder, used in all early Gatlings, produced enormous quantities of white smoke that obscured the gunner's view of the target. After a few dozen rounds, a Gatling crew would be firing blind through their own smoke cloud. Black powder also left heavy fouling in the barrels and mechanisms, requiring frequent cleaning. Smokeless powder, developed independently by several chemists in the 1880s and rapidly adopted by military forces worldwide, eliminated these problems. Smokeless powder produced minimal visible smoke, allowing gunners to observe their targets throughout an engagement. It generated less fouling, reducing maintenance requirements. It also produced higher muzzle velocities than black powder of equivalent weight, extending effective range. The M1893 Gatling, chambered for the new .30 Army smokeless cartridge adopted by the United States military, represented the culmination of 30 years of refinement. The M1893 featured 6 barrels that could be increased to 10 for naval or fortification mounting. The gun used the Bruce feed system with curved magazines holding multiple rows of cartridges. Rate of fire reached 800 to 900 rounds per minute in short bursts, though sustained fire at 600 rounds per minute was recommended to prevent overheating. The gun weighed approximately 600 pounds without its mount, making it more portable than earlier models, but still far heavier than competing single-barrel automatic weapons. The Model 1900 Gatling featured further improvements to the feed mechanism and the option for gas operation. But by 1900, the Gatling's era was ending. Each incremental improvement in ammunition technology and feed system design made the Gatling more effective, but these same improvements benefited single-barrel automatic weapons even more. A Maxim gun using smokeless powder and brass cartridges could fire 600 rounds per minute with a 2-man crew and weigh less than half what a Gatling weighed. The Browning machine guns developed in the 1890s offered similar advantages, but the gun's success rested fundamentally on a mismatch in technological sophistication and tactical doctrine. Gatling guns dominated in conflicts where one side possessed industrial manufacturing capability and the other did not, and where one side understood the tactical employment of concentrated firepower, while the other relied on traditional assault tactics. Against Zulu warriors with spears charging in massed formations, Turkmen cavalry with sabers attempting frontal assaults, or Lakota fighters with single-shot rifles operating in relatively open terrain, the Gatling was devastatingly effective. The rate of fire, the range, and the psychological impact combined to break attacks before they could close with the defenders. Against opponents with comparable industrial technology, particularly opponents equipped with modern artillery, entrenchments, and their own machine guns, the Gatling was far less decisive. At Petersburg during the Civil War, Gatlings provided useful suppressive fire during the siege but did not break the Confederate lines. The siege lasted 10 months and ended only when General Grant cut Lee's supply lines and forced evacuation. In the static trench warfare that would characterize World War I, machine guns would prove essential, but they would be single-barrel automatic weapons like the Maxim, Vickers, and Browning, not Gatlings. These guns were lighter, required smaller crews, and could be positioned in trenches or fortifications, where their low profile made them difficult to target with artillery. The Gatling's tactical niche was specific and limited. It excelled in suppression of massed infantry or cavalry attacks, particularly in open terrain where visibility was good and the targets presented themselves in concentrations. Mounted on fortifications, it provided formidable defensive firepower. Mounted on river gunboats, it could bring concentrated fire to bear against targets along riverbanks. Used offensively, as at San Juan Hill, it could support assaults by pinning down defenders, though its weight limited this application. But the Gatling could not maneuver with infantry over rough ground. Its weight required horses or oxen to move. It could not provide suppressive fire from concealment. It consumed ammunition at a rate that required substantial logistics to sustain. A single Gatling firing at 600 rounds per minute for just 10 minutes required 6,000 rounds of ammunition weighing several hundred pounds. These limitations became increasingly apparent as tactics evolved and lighter automatic weapons became available. The Gatling's tactical niche was suppression of massed infantry or cavalry attacks, particularly in open terrain where the gun's weight was less of a handicap. Mounted on fortifications or ships, it provided formidable defensive firepower. Used offensively, as at San Juan Hill, it could support assaults by pinning down defenders, but it could not maneuver with infantry over rough ground. could not provide suppressive fire from concealment in the way lighter weapons could, and consumed ammunition at a rate that required substantial logistics to sustain. Gatling himself provided a convenient myth about his intentions that obscured the gun's actual impact. In 1877, he wrote, "If I could invent a machine, a gun, which could, by its rapidity of fire, enable one man to do as much battle duty as 100, that it would, to a large extent, supersede the necessity of large armies, and consequently, exposure to battle and disease would be greatly diminished." This statement positioned Gatling as a humanitarian inventor who sought to reduce casualties by reducing army sizes. He had studied medicine after witnessing death from disease. He was aware that in the Civil War, disease killed twice as many soldiers as combat. But this reasoning ignored a fundamental reality. Wars are not fought to minimize casualties, but to achieve political objectives. Concentrated firepower does not reduce the size of armies. It changes the calculus of attack and defense. A handful of men with Gatlings could hold a position against hundreds of attackers, but that did not lead nations to field smaller armies. It led them to field armies equipped with their own Gatlings, and later with automatic weapons even more effective. The result was not fewer soldiers, but more lethal battles. The truth, visible in every conflict where Gatling saw use, was that the gun increased lethality asymmetrically. It allowed technologically advanced forces to dominate technologically inferior ones, with minimal casualties to the advantaged side and devastating casualties to the disadvantaged. The immediate consequence of the Gatling gun's deployment in the late 19th century was the expansion of European and American imperial reach. The gun made colonial wars cheaper and less risky for colonizing powers. A company of British troops with a Gatling could pacify regions that would have required a battalion without it. The gun reduced the cost in European lives of suppressing resistance, which made suppression more politically palatable. The long-term consequence was the acceleration of automatic weapons development. The Gatling demonstrated that rapid fire was tactically valuable, but it also demonstrated the limitations of hand-cranked systems. Inventors raced to create fully automatic weapons that used the gun's own firing cycle to reload and fire continuously. Hiram Maxim succeeded in 1883. John Browning followed with multiple designs. By 1911, when the United States Army declared the Gatling gun obsolete, the era of single-barrel automatic weapons was well established. World War I, just 3 years later, would demonstrate the horrific effectiveness of automatic weapons in trench warfare. Machine guns firing 500 rounds per minute turned frontal assaults into slaughter. The casualty rates that Gatling hoped to reduce instead spiraled into millions of dead. The Gatling gun's design legacy, however, was not obsolete. It was dormant. During World War II, Nazi Germany experimented with externally powered rotary guns for aircraft use, though none reached production. In the 1960s, facing the need for reliable, high rate-of-fire weapons for helicopter gunships in Vietnam, General Electric engineers revisited the Gatling principle. They created the M134 Minigun, a 6-barrel electrically powered rotary gun, firing 7.62 mm NATO rounds at rates up to 6,000 rounds per minute. The minigun proved exactly what the military needed, a weapon that could lay down suppressive fire without the jamming problems that plagued single-barrel guns under sustained fire. The same principle, scaled up, led to the M61 Vulcan 20 mm rotary cannon and other systems. The modern minigun and Vulcan cannons vindicated Gatling's core insight. Multiple rotating barrels solve the heat and reliability problems inherent in rapid fire. What the 1890s military could not use, the 1960s military found essential. For conservation and historical memory, the Gatling gun occupies a curious position. Specimens survive in museums worldwide, often displayed as curiosities from a quaint era before modern warfare. Working replicas are fired at historical reenactments and demonstrations, their chattering bark evoking the romance of the Old West. Yet serious military historians recognize the Gatling not as a curiosity, but as a pivot point, the weapon that bridged the gap between the age of single-shot rifles and the age of automatic fire. The gun forced military thinkers to grapple with questions that remain unresolved. How do you deploy concentrated firepower ethically? How do you balance technological advantage with the laws of war? How do you prevent the proliferation of weapons that advantage the strong against the weak? These were not questions the 19th century answered, and they are not questions we have answered today. The Gatling Gun Company ceased independent operations in 1897 when it was fully absorbed by Colt. The last Gatling guns manufactured in the United States rolled off Colt's Hartford production line in 1911. The official end came when the U.S. Army declared all remaining Gatlings obsolete and began rearming with Browning automatic machine guns and other modern weapons. The transition was quiet, a bureaucratic sunset for a weapon that had once seemed revolutionary. Richard Jordan Gatling spent the final years of his life in declining health and financial difficulty. Although he had prospered from his inventions and held numerous patents, he made and lost several fortunes through investments. In 1897, Gatling and his wife Jemima sold their Hartford mansion. They moved back to St. Louis, Missouri, where Gatling hoped to form a new company to manufacture steam plows and tractors, returning to the agricultural machinery that had first brought him success. In 1900, he patented a motor-driven plow, but he lacked the capital to commercialize it. On February 26, 1903, while visiting his daughter in New York City and meeting with his patent agency, Richard Jordan Gatling died at his daughter's home. He was 84 years old. He was interred at Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis, the city where he had first achieved prominence and where his gun had been born. Obituaries noted his many inventions and credited him as the father of the machine gun. They praised his ingenuity and his humanitarian motives. They did not tally the number of men, women, and children who had died under fire from his invention. That accounting was left to historians. During World War II, the United States Navy honored Gatling by christening the Fletcher-class destroyer DD-671 as the USS Gatling. The ship served in the Pacific Theater and survived the war. It was a fitting tribute in a conflict where mechanized killing reached unprecedented scale. Gatling would have recognized the trajectory. His invention, born in an effort to reduce casualties, had instead helped inaugurate an age where industrial nations measured their military power in the tonnage of steel and the rate of fire of their weapons. Whether he would have approved is unknowable. His public statements always emphasized humanitarian intent. His private correspondence, much of it lost, might have revealed doubt or justification. What is certain is that Richard Gatling did what inventors do. He saw a problem, devised a mechanical solution, and pursued its implementation with energy and persistence. The consequences, intended and unintended, outlived him by generations. November 4th, 1862. That Tuesday afternoon when patent number 36836 was signed. 2 men turned a crank and fed cartridges into a hopper, and 200 rounds spat from 6 barrels in 60 seconds. The paper cartridges jammed sometimes. The gun weighed 700 pounds and required a team of horses to move. It was crude, unproven, and rejected by the military minds of its time. 49 years later, on a quiet day in a War Department office, a clerk stamped a stack of inventory documents. Obsolete. The Gatling guns, more than 1,000 produced, were relegated to storage, museums, or scrap. Single-barrel automatic machine guns had supplanted them. The age of the hand crank was over, but the principle endured. In 1963, as American soldiers prepared to deploy to Southeast Asian jungles, engineers at General Electric attached an electric motor to a 6-barrel rotating assembly. The M134 minigun fired 6,000 rounds per minute. Helicopter door gunners in Vietnam, pilots over Iraq, special operations forces in Afghanistan. They all relied on electrically powered rotating barrels, multiple barrels cycling through load-fire-eject sequences, barrels that cooled while others fired. The principle was Gatlings, proven again in the crucible of modern combat. The humanitarian dream died in trenches and colonial massacres. The mechanical insight lived on, resurrected whenever the problem recurred. How to fire faster without jamming, how to concentrate lethal force in an operator's hands, how to tip the balance when speed of fire determines survival. That is the legacy. Not the man's intentions, but the machine's utility. Not the stated purpose, but the documented effect. Richard Gatling gave the world a gun that could be cranked by hand to fire 200 times a minute. The world took that gift and built an architecture of mechanized killing that now fires thousands of times a minute, that equips drones and aircraft and vehicles, that has spread to every military on Earth. One invention, one patent, one November afternoon in 1862, when a clerk signed his name and set in motion a cascade of consequences that continues today. The barrels still rotate. The bolts still cycle. The rate of fire keeps climbing. And the distance between the inventor's hope and the weapon's reality remains as vast as it was on that first cold day in Indianapolis when Richard Gatling watched his prototype chatter and believed he was saving lives.